He had been a police officer for more than 15 years, long enough to think he had seen everything. He believed he could read people in a single glance. That confidence had turned into pride over the years, and that pride had slowly grown into something darker without him noticing. He told himself he was fair, that he just went by instinct. But the truth was that his instincts were built on judgment, and judgment was built on bias. Every morning he put on his uniform with a sense of authority. The polished badge on his chest reminded him of who he was, someone who kept order, someone people respected and feared. When he walked into the station, his colleagues nodded. They called him old school, meaning he didn't like new ideas about how police should change. He thought those ideas made the force look weak. To him, control was everything. That day began like any other. The air outside was heavy with summer heat. The city streets were busy with traffic, kids walking to school and people heading to work. He sat in his patrol car sipping his coffee, watching the world through his windshield. His partner had taken the day off, so he was alone, which he preferred. He liked being in charge, with no one to question how he handled things. He drove through a quiet neighborhood where big houses stood behind clean lawns. He noticed a dark sedan turning onto the main road, a car that looked a little too expensive for the area it came from. The driver seemed young. Something about it bothered him. Maybe it was the way the driver looked in the mirror, or maybe it was just his own thoughts whispering old assumptions. He followed the car for a few blocks, watching carefully. The car wasn't speeding, wasn't breaking any laws, but he convinced himself there was something suspicious. He turned on his lights. The car pulled over smoothly. The driver didn't look scared, just calm, maybe even slightly irritated. The officer stepped out, adjusting his belt, and approached the window with his usual firm stride. "License and registration," he said. His voice flat but sharp. The driver handed over the papers right away. "Sure, officer." "Is there a problem?" The question rubbed him the wrong way. He didn't like being questioned. "I'll ask the questions," he replied. The young man nodded, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "Of course." The officer looked over the license. The name was unfamiliar, but the address was only a few streets away. He scanned the car interior with his eyes. Everything looked clean. No smell of smoke, no open containers, nothing out of place. Yet something inside him kept saying there had to be more to the story. He started asking random questions. Where the man was headed, where he worked, why he was in this neighborhood so early. The driver answered politely, though confusion started showing on his face. "I work nearby. I was just on my way to the office." The officer stared at him for a moment, trying to find cracks in his calm tone. He didn't like how composed the man was. He expected nervousness, maybe fear. That calmness felt like defiance to him. Pride can twist perception, and that's what was happening now. After a pause, the officer said, "Step out of the vehicle." The driver hesitated. "May I ask why, sir?" "Because I said so," the officer replied, trying to hide the irritation in his voice. People began slowing their cars nearby, curious about the flashing lights. The man finally stepped out. He wasn't rude or loud, just careful with his words. "I've done nothing wrong, officer." "I gave you my license and registration." The officer crossed his arms. "We'll see about that. Stay where I can see you." A small tension filled the air. The officer could feel it, but instead of calming down, his pride made him double down. He looked around, making sure everyone could see who was in control. The young man stood quietly beside his car, keeping his tone measured. "I know my rights," the man said softly. "I don't want trouble." That sentence was like a spark. The officer felt his authority being challenged. He'd heard that line too many times before, often from people who ended up guilty of something. Without thinking, he searched the car, ignoring the man's protests. There was nothing. No drugs, no weapons, not even a scratch on the interior. When he finished, the officer looked disappointed, not relieved. He didn't find anything wrong, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. Instead, he kept pressing. "You sure this car's yours?" The man gave a faint smile, half amused, half sad. "Yes, officer. It's mine. I bought it last year." The officer looked at the registration again, as if hoping it would suddenly prove him right. "You said you work nearby? What kind of work?" "I'm a legal consultant," the man said. "I handle community cases." The officer frowned. "Legal consultant? For who?" "Mostly city projects," the man replied calmly. "And sometimes the mayor's office." That made the officer pause for a second, but he quickly brushed it off. "We'll verify that," he said coldly. The driver looked him straight in the eye now. "You can, but you're making a mistake. You're stopping me for something that only exists in your mind." The words hit harder than expected. The officer's jaw tightened. In that moment, he didn't care about right or wrong, only about winning the exchange. His ego was louder than his judgment. He reached for his radio, calling in a check on the license plate. He could hear his own voice shake slightly, a mix of frustration and stubborn pride. While he waited for a response, he noticed someone across the street holding up a phone, recording. His stomach tightened. He hated being filmed, hated losing control of the story. The man beside him saw it too, but stayed silent. He simply stood there, calm, unafraid. A few seconds later, the radio confirmed everything. License valid, registration clean, no warrants, no issues. The officer knew that should have been the end of it. He could have given a short apology and let the man go. But he didn't. Instead, he kept the man there, pretending to double-check something on his notepad. The man finally said, "Officer, can I go now?" "Not yet," the officer muttered. The silence between them stretched. The young man sighed softly. "You know, this isn't about the car or the paperwork, is it?" The officer didn't respond. He could feel his chest tighten, as if someone had read his thoughts out loud. He looked away, pretending to be busy with his radio again. The man spoke again, quieter this time. "I don't hate you, officer, but I hope one day you see what you're doing right now." That calm tone, that gentle honesty, it made something inside the officer uncomfortable. Not angry, just uneasy, because deep down he knew the man was right. Finally, he gave back the documents and said stiffly, "You can go." The man nodded, took his papers, and before getting back in his car, said something the officer would never forget. "You'll regret this when you learn who I am." The car drove off smoothly, leaving the officer standing in the heat, heart pounding for reasons he couldn't explain. He told himself the man was bluffing, just trying to scare him. But that line kept echoing in his head. Back in the patrol car, he stared at his reflection in the side mirror. For the first time in a long while, he didn't like the man he saw. But his pride quickly buried that feeling. He turned the key, muttered under his breath, and drove off, pretending the encounter hadn't bothered him. Yet all day, it lingered. He found himself replaying every second of it. The man's steady eyes, the way he never raised his voice, the way he spoke like someone who had nothing to hide. That calmness was haunting. It wasn't fear. It was confidence. Later, when he returned to the station, he mentioned the stop casually to a colleague, leaving out the part about being filmed. His colleague shrugged. "Probably nothing. You did your job." He nodded, but the reassurance didn't help. That night, when he got home, his wife noticed something off about him. "Rough day?" she asked. "Just another traffic stop," he replied. But he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. He scrolled through social media before bed and froze when he saw a short clip, a video of him during the stop. Someone had already posted it. The caption read, "Unjust stop for no reason." It wasn't going viral yet, but the comments were starting. Some defended the officer, but most didn't. They questioned his motives, his tone, his behavior. His heart sank. He turned off the phone, hoping it would all blow over. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Something about that man, something about that day was going to come back to him. He just didn't know how yet. The next morning, he returned to work pretending nothing had changed. His partner joked about the online clip, saying, "Man, they film everything these days." "You gotta watch yourself." He forced a laugh, but it wasn't funny. His pride told him to ignore it, but a small voice inside whispered that maybe this time he really was wrong. That whisper made him uncomfortable, so he pushed it away. He told himself he'd handled it by the book, but somewhere in his gut he knew that wasn't true. He hadn't stopped that man for breaking a rule. He'd stopped him because of how he looked. And now, whether he liked it or not, that decision had started something that would soon expose everything he didn't want to face. The next morning, the officer woke up earlier than usual. He didn't know why he couldn't sleep well. Maybe it was the heat, or maybe it was that video still sitting in the back of his mind. He didn't even want to look at his phone, afraid the clip might have spread further overnight, but curiosity got the best of him. He picked it up and opened the social app again. The post had grown, hundreds of comments now, then thousands. People were arguing. Some said he was just doing his job, but most accused him of targeting an innocent man. The video didn't show everything, just enough to make him look bad. His tone, the unnecessary questions, the man's calm words. Watching it again, he realized how cold he sounded, how much like the officers he used to criticize when he was younger. He told himself it was unfair. People didn't understand what it was like being a cop, always on guard, always suspicious. Still, a part of him couldn't ignore how the man in the video had looked at him. Not scared, not angry, just disappointed. That bothered him more than the comments. When he reached the station, he tried to act normal. A few of his co-workers gave him looks. One of them, a younger officer who liked scrolling through social media, gave him a smirk. "You're trending, man," he said. "You're all over the local news pages." The officer forced a short laugh. People have nothing better to do, but it wasn't funny. He went straight to his desk and turned on the computer. An internal email was already waiting for him. It was from his supervisor, asking him to stop by later that day. That wasn't a good sign. He leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. He thought about calling the man from the traffic stop, maybe to apologize, maybe just to explain. But then he shook his head. That would make him look guilty. He didn't think he was guilty, or maybe he just didn't want to admit that he might be. When he entered his supervisor's office later that morning, the air felt heavier. The supervisor looked calm but serious. "We've got some heat from yesterday," he said. "That video's making rounds. The department's getting calls. News outlets are asking for a statement." The officer nodded, pretending not to care. "People always overreact online." "Maybe," the supervisor said. "But the man you stopped, do you know who he is?" The question caught him off guard. "Some guy in a fancy car," he replied. The supervisor sighed. "He's not just some guy, he's a civil rights attorney. Works with the mayor's office on community reform projects. He's actually been helping review police policies." The words hit hard, like someone had just punched the air out of his chest. He didn't respond for a few seconds. "You're kidding." "I wish I was," the supervisor said quietly. "You picked the wrong day to pull over the wrong man." The officer tried to explain himself. He looked suspicious. "I was following procedure. Was he breaking the law?" "No, but..." The supervisor raised a hand. "Then you weren't following procedure. Look, I'm not throwing you under the bus, but this looks bad, especially with that video. The higher-ups are already talking about it. They want an internal review." The officer's pride flared up again. "So now we're letting social media decide how we do our jobs?" "No," the supervisor said firmly. "We're letting common sense do it." That silence after was thick. The officer left the office feeling smaller than he had in years. As he walked through the station, he could feel the eyes on him. Curious, judgmental, a few even pitying. He hated it. He had always been the one people looked up to. Now they were looking down on him. He spent the rest of the day avoiding calls, doing paperwork, anything to stay off the streets. The truth was, he didn't want to face anyone. He didn't want to see how people were starting to treat him differently. That evening, when he got home, his wife was waiting at the door. She had already seen the news. "They're showing it everywhere," she said softly. "Even the city channel. They're saying the man filed a complaint." He sat down heavily on the couch. "Of course he did. Are you in trouble?" "I don't know yet," he said. She sat beside him quietly. "You've always been proud of what you do. But maybe it's time to listen to what people are saying." He frowned. "You think I'm a bad person now too?" "I didn't say that," she said calmly. "I just think sometimes pride makes people blind." He didn't respond. Her words stung because they sounded too much like the truth. Days passed and the tension grew. News stations started replaying the footage, discussing it during talk shows. Community leaders called for an investigation. Some even demanded his suspension. He tried to ignore it all. But it was everywhere, on TV, on the radio, even in casual conversations when he went out for coffee. At the station, some officers supported him quietly, saying it could have happened to anyone. Others distanced themselves, afraid of being linked to the controversy. It was like being surrounded by people but feeling completely alone. Then one morning a letter arrived, an official notice that he was being placed on temporary leave pending investigation. It wasn't a surprise, but it still hurt. The supervisor told him it was standard procedure, but he could hear the disappointment in the man's voice. He cleared out his locker, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The sound of his boots on the tile floor echoed in the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the parking lot, he just sat in his car for a long time staring at the steering wheel. He didn't know what to do with himself. At home, things felt different too. His wife tried to be supportive, but she was quiet most of the time. His teenage son barely spoke to him. When he did, it was awkward. "Dad, why'd you stop that guy?" he asked one night at dinner. "I was doing my job," the officer said softly. His son looked down. "Everyone at school's talking about it." The words were small but sharp. They cut deep. He started taking long drives just to clear his head. He'd park somewhere quiet and think about the man he'd stopped. The man's calm eyes, his steady voice, and it all came back again and again. He remembered how he had said, "You'll regret this when you learn who I am." And he had been right. One day, while sitting alone at a cafe, he overheard two people talking at a nearby table. They were discussing a community event, a town hall where the same attorney was supposed to speak about police reform. The officer sat frozen for a moment. Something in him wanted to go, though he didn't know why. Maybe curiosity, maybe guilt. That evening he went. He didn't wear his uniform, just plain clothes and a cap pulled low. He sat in the back row unnoticed. The room was full. People from all walks of life talking openly about justice, fairness, and respect. And then the man walked in, the same man from the traffic stop, the one who had turned his world upside down. When the man began speaking, the room fell quiet. He didn't sound angry or bitter. He spoke with calm strength, saying how people needed to see each other as humans first, not as threats or statistics. He talked about fear, how it shaped behavior on both sides. The officer listened, his chest tight. It wasn't the words that hit hardest. It was the tone. There was compassion in it, not hatred. At one point, someone asked the man if he forgave the officer from the video. The whole room went silent. The man paused, thinking carefully. Then he said, "I don't hold hatred for him, but I do hope he learns from it. Because understanding starts when we face the truth, even if it hurts." Those words stayed with the officer for days. They followed him home into his dreams, into the silence of the mornings when he sat alone with his coffee. He realized he didn't hate the man either. In fact, for the first time, he respected him. Weeks later, the department's internal review called him back for questioning. They asked about his motives, his decision-making, his training. It was uncomfortable, but he answered honestly. For the first time, he admitted that maybe he had let assumptions guide him. He didn't use the word racism. He couldn't bring himself to say it yet. But deep inside, he knew that was exactly what it was. When he left the building, reporters were waiting outside. Cameras flashed. Microphones were pushed toward him. Someone asked, "Do you regret what you did?" He stopped for a moment, looking at all the faces staring at him. He could have said something defensive, something to protect himself. But instead, he said quietly, "I regret that I forgot what it means to serve people with fairness." Then he walked away. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept a little better. The truth was still painful, but it felt lighter somehow, like a weight he'd been carrying was starting to lift even just a bit. What he didn't know yet was that the story wasn't over. The investigation still had to decide his future, and the city still had strong opinions about him. But deep inside, something had already begun to change. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking like a cop trying to prove himself. He was thinking like a man trying to understand himself. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation kept hanging over his head like a heavy cloud. Each morning, he woke up and felt that same tightness in his chest, the kind that never really went away. He had spent years telling himself he was a good cop, one who followed the rules and kept people safe. But now that belief was slipping away, and he didn't know how to handle it. He stopped wearing his uniform while on leave, even when he didn't have to. Seeing it made him feel uncomfortable, almost ashamed. His badge, once a source of pride, now sat in a drawer on his nightstand. Sometimes he'd open the drawer just to look at it, but he'd quickly close it again. Everywhere he went, people seemed to recognize him. Not everyone said anything, but the looks were enough. Some were cold, some were curious, and a few were simply sad. He wished he could tell them that he wasn't a bad person, that he never meant to hurt anyone, but he didn't even know if he still believed that himself. One afternoon, He went out for a walk. He needed to clear his mind, but the streets didn't feel the same anymore. The same sidewalks he used to patrol now felt foreign. He passed by a group of kids playing basketball. One of them glanced at him, then whispered something to his friend. They both stared for a moment, and he could tell they recognized him from the video. That quiet judgment hurt more than words. Later, he sat on a park bench and watched people passing by. He noticed how some of them smiled at each other, how they helped strangers, how they simply went about their lives without fear. He wondered when he had stopped seeing people that way, as humans. Somewhere along the years, the job had changed him, or maybe he had changed himself and just never noticed. He started attending therapy sessions the department had offered him before his suspension. At first, he didn't want to go. He told himself it was unnecessary, that he didn't need to talk to anyone. But he was tired of the noise in his head, so he went anyway. The therapist was calm and patient. She didn't judge him. She asked him questions that made him think, questions about his past, his experiences, and the way he saw people. He realized that much of his behavior came from fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of losing control, fear of being seen as weak. "Do you think you treated that man unfairly?" she asked during one session. He stayed quiet for a while before answering. "I think I treated him the way I was taught to see people like him." "And what way is that?" she asked gently. He looked down, with suspicion first. That silence that followed said everything. He felt it deep inside, a truth he couldn't avoid anymore. At home, his wife noticed small changes. He talked less but listened more. He started asking questions about how others felt, something he hadn't done much before. One night, he admitted, "I used to think being tough made me right, but I think it just made me blind." She smiled faintly, relieved to see a part of him softening again. Then one morning, he received a call from the department. The review board had reached a decision. He was to return for a hearing to discuss his future on the force. He didn't know what to expect, whether it meant getting his job back or losing it forever. Either way, he decided he'd face it honestly. When he entered the building for the hearing, everyone seemed quieter than usual. He saw the department head, the supervisor, and a few community board members sitting across the table. Among them was someone he didn't expect, the attorney, the man from the traffic stop. For a second, his heart skipped. He hadn't seen him since that day. The man looked composed, just as before, calm, confident, but not arrogant. Their eyes met briefly. There was no anger in that look, just a quiet kind of strength. The hearing began. They asked him to describe what happened that day. This time, he didn't try to defend himself. He told the truth, how he had acted on instinct, how he had felt suspicious for no good reason, how pride had made him push further when he should have stopped. One of the board members asked, "So you admit your actions were not justified?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, I do. I made assumptions, and I understand now that those assumptions were wrong." The room stayed silent for a moment. Then the attorney spoke for the first time. "Do you understand why what you did mattered beyond just that moment?" The officer turned toward him. "Because it wasn't just about me and you," he said quietly. "It was about what I represented, the kind of treatment people like you face every day. I was part of the problem, even if I didn't mean to be." The man nodded slightly, not in approval but in acknowledgement. "That's an honest answer," he said softly. After the meeting, they told him he would remain suspended for a while longer, but would be given a chance to attend community workshops on bias and awareness. It wasn't a punishment as much as it was a chance to learn. He left the building feeling drained but oddly relieved. For the first time, he hadn't tried to hide behind excuses. He had told the truth, and even though it hurt, it felt freeing. A few days later, he began attending those workshops. They were held in a community center, the kind of place he used to drive by without a second thought. Inside, there were people from all backgrounds, students, workers, parents, even a few former officers. Everyone shared their stories about times they had been judged unfairly or treated poorly. At first, he sat quietly, just listening. Some stories made him uncomfortable. Others made him sad. Then one evening, when it was his turn to speak, he stood up slowly and said, "I thought I knew what justice meant. But I was wrong. I confused control with fairness. I confused fear with safety. I thought I was protecting people, but sometimes I was just protecting my own pride." The room was silent, but it wasn't a hostile silence. It was understanding. For once, he wasn't being attacked. He was being heard. After that night, people started talking to him differently. Some still kept their distance, but others appreciated that he was trying. A few even thanked him for being honest. That surprised him more than anything. One evening after a session, he was leaving the community center when he saw the attorney standing near the door, talking to a few people. The man noticed him and walked over. "I didn't expect to see you here," the attorney said. "I didn't expect to be here either," he replied. "But I'm glad I came." The man nodded. "Change doesn't happen overnight. But showing up is where it starts." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them no longer tense. Finally, the officer said, "I never apologized to you properly." The man looked at him thoughtfully. "You don't owe me words. Just do better." "I will," the officer said quietly. "I mean it," the man extended his hand. It wasn't a warm handshake, but it was sincere. Two men acknowledging the same truth from different sides. As days went by, the officer started spending more time in the community. He volunteered at youth events, helped with food drives, and spoke with people he used to see only through a car window. The more he listened, the more he realized how disconnected he had been. People weren't the problem. His way of seeing them was slowly that old pride of his began to fade. In its place grew something different, and humility. He didn't walk around trying to prove he was right anymore. He just wanted to be better. At home, his family noticed the change too. His son began talking to him again, asking about the workshops, about what he was learning. His wife smiled more. There was peace in the house again, a quiet kind of peace that came from honesty. Still, not everyone forgave him. Some people in the department thought he was weak for admitting fault. They said he had given in to public pressure. But he didn't care anymore. He realized that the respect he had once chased wasn't real respect. It was fear dressed as authority. One evening, while driving home, he saw a car pulled over on the side of the road with a flat tire. A young man stood beside it, looking frustrated. The officer pulled over to help. When the man saw him step out, his face tensed slightly, that instinctive fear that came from seeing a cop. "It's all right," the officer said gently. "I'm not here for trouble. Just need a hand?" The man hesitated, then nodded. Together, they changed the tire. It took only a few minutes, but that small act meant something. When they finished, the young man said, "Thanks. I didn't expect that." The officer smiled faintly. "Yeah, most people don't." As he drove away, he realized how strange life was, how one mistake had brought him to a place he never expected to be. A place where he saw the world not in black and white, not in uniforms and rules, but in faces, stories, and shared humanity. That night, he sat on his porch, looking up at the quiet sky. He thought about how everything had changed, his career, his pride, even his view of himself. But deep down, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Because he was finally starting to understand what it really meant to serve people. And though he still had a long way to go, for the first time, he wasn't afraid to face it. The days after the video spread online felt like a storm that wouldn't stop. The officer who once walked with confidence now felt eyes on him wherever he went. Every corner of the city seemed to whisper his name. He could feel the weight of judgment following him like a shadow. When he turned on the television, his face was there. When he scrolled through his phone, there were posts, comments, and videos replaying the same moment that had changed his life. At first, he tried to defend himself in his mind. He told himself that he was just doing his duty, that he hadn't meant to be cruel. But as more details came out, as people spoke about how unfair it was, his excuses began to sound weaker even to himself. He knew deep down that the problem wasn't just one bad day. It was something that had been growing in him for years, and now it was out for everyone to see. He had always believed that being a police officer gave him power, respect, and control. He had worked hard to earn his badge, and he thought it made him better than others. But now his badge didn't feel like pride anymore. It felt like a mark of shame. The same people who once thanked him on the street now turned away. When he walked into the local diner where he used to have breakfast, the waitress gave him a half-hearted smile and placed his coffee without a word. Two men sitting by the counter stopped talking when he walked in. He pretended not to notice, but he could feel the silence cutting into him. At home, things were no easier. His wife barely spoke to him. She had seen the video too, and while she didn't say it out loud, he could see the disappointment in her eyes. His teenage son avoided him completely, spending hours locked in his room. The officer didn't blame them. He couldn't even look at himself in the mirror without feeling disgusted. Days turned into weeks and he received a notice from the department. He was suspended from duty until the investigation was complete. That single line shattered what little hope he had left. He placed the letter on the kitchen table and sat there in silence for hours. The house felt cold. His life, once built around routine and pride, had suddenly stopped. He thought about the young man he had arrested. He remembered the calm in his voice, the way he didn't fight back or raise his tone, even when he was being humiliated. There was something about that calmness that haunted him. It was as if the young man knew how it would all play out, as if he had already seen through him. The news reported that the man was a civil rights attorney, someone who worked to bring fairness and change to the justice system. The irony hit the officer hard. He had arrested a man whose whole job was to fix the kind of bias that had destroyed his own career. The public called it karma. He called it a lesson he should have learned long ago. As weeks passed, the officer stayed at home most days, avoiding the world. He tried to keep busy by fixing things around the house, tightening loose hinges, mowing the lawn, cleaning the garage. But nothing helped. Every sound, every thought seemed to bring him back to that day. He could still hear the young man saying, "You'll regret this when you learn who I am." And he had. Not because of the man's identity, but because of what it revealed about himself. One evening, he sat in front of his computer and opened an email from the department. It contained the official statement of his suspension, the ongoing review, and a recommendation for sensitivity and bias training. He almost laughed. For years, he had mocked those sessions, calling them a waste of time. Now they were being forced on him. He wanted to delete the email, to pretend it didn't exist, but something stopped him. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was exhaustion. He had spent so many years fighting everyone, and now he didn't have the strength to fight anymore. He decided to attend the sessions. The first day, he walked into a small community center wearing plain clothes. There were people of all kinds, different ages, different backgrounds, some police officers, some citizens. He didn't talk to anyone. He just sat in the back, crossing his arms and keeping his head low. The instructor started by asking everyone to share why they were there. When it was his turn, he hesitated. For a moment, he wanted to lie, to say it was just part of his job, but the words wouldn't come. So he simply said, "Because I messed up." The room went quiet. No one laughed or judged. The instructor nodded and moved on. That simple response felt heavier than he expected. For the first time in years, he had spoken without pride or defense. As the weeks went on, he listened to people share stories about being unfairly treated, stories about fear, humiliation, and hopelessness. He realized how his actions, even small ones, could leave scars on someone else's life. There was an older woman who said she still trembled whenever she saw a police car. There was a young man who said he was tired of being seen as a threat just because of his skin color. The officer sat there, feeling smaller each time he listened. He had never thought about how people saw him in uniform. To him, it had always meant safety. To others, it meant danger. After one session, he stayed behind to help stack chairs. The instructor thanked him and asked quietly, "Do you think you'll go back to the force?" He didn't answer right away. He thought about it all night. For years, being a cop was his identity. Without it, he didn't know who he was. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe he had been hiding behind the badge for too long. The investigation ended 2 months later. The department's decision came with mixed results. He wasn't fired, but his reputation was ruined. He would be put on probation and required to continue community work. When he heard the news, he felt both relief and shame. He had kept his job, but he had lost everything else: his respect, his pride, and the trust of those around him. He wanted to apologize publicly, but every draft he wrote sounded hollow. So instead, he wrote a letter to the young attorney he had wronged. It wasn't long or dramatic. He simply wrote that he was sorry and that he now understood how much damage one moment of arrogance could do. He didn't know if the man would ever read it, but sending it made him feel a little lighter. A few days later, he received an unexpected response. The young man wrote back, saying he appreciated the apology and hoped that something good would come out of what had happened. He didn't sound angry or bitter. He even wrote that he believed people could change if they were willing to listen. Those words stayed with the officer. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to hope. He started volunteering at the same community center where the sessions were held. He helped organize food drives and mentored kids who were curious about becoming police officers. At first they avoided him when they recognized him from the video, but over time they began to see that he wasn't the same man anymore. He didn't lecture them about authority or rules. He talked about respect, understanding, and humility. One afternoon a boy asked him, "Why did you become a cop?" He paused before answering. "I used to think it was for power," he said. "Now I know it should have been for service." Those words weren't rehearsed. They came from somewhere deep inside him, a place that had been buried under years of pride and anger. He still had bad days. There were moments when he felt judged, when people crossed the street to avoid him, when whispers followed him into stores. But instead of fighting it, he accepted it. He knew it was the consequence of what he had done. What mattered now was what he did moving forward. He began meeting with new recruits at the police academy, sharing his experience not as a warning but as a confession. He told them that wearing a badge didn't make them better than anyone else. It made them accountable. Some recruits listened quietly. Others avoided his eyes, but a few came up afterward to thank him. That small gratitude reminded him that maybe his mistake could still serve a purpose. At home, things slowly improved. His wife started talking to him again, not about the incident, but about everyday things: dinner, bills, plans for their son. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was a start. His son eventually asked him if he was still working. When he said yes, his son nodded and said, "Just don't mess it up again." It made him smile for the first time in months. The officer still carried the weight of what he had done, but now it pushed him to be better. He no longer walked with pride, but with awareness. The man he had been before that day no longer existed. The uniform didn't define him anymore. What defined him now was the quiet effort to make things right, one small step at a time. He had once believed that losing his pride would destroy him. But as time went on, he learned that pride wasn't what he needed, it was humility. Pride had built walls around him. Humility helped him tear them down. The world still remembered his mistake, but a few also began to notice his change. And though forgiveness didn't come easily, it came slowly, like light returning after a long storm. He finally understood that being a good officer wasn't about power. It was about humanity. It was about seeing people, not labels. And as he looked at the people around him, the community, the families, the kids who still believed in fairness, he realized that his biggest punishment had also been his greatest gift, because losing his pride had made him find his heart again. Months had passed since the officer had been given a second chance. The season had changed, but his life still carried the quiet weight of reflection. Each day he woke up earlier than before. He made coffee, sat near the small window in his kitchen, and watched the sunrise. He didn't scroll through the news anymore. He didn't read the comments that still floated online about him. He had stopped trying to fix his image in the eyes of strangers. Instead, he focused on fixing the way he saw himself. He had been working part-time at the community center for weeks, helping with youth programs and mentoring kids who dreamed of becoming police officers. At first, most of them didn't know who he was. They just saw a man who showed up every morning, listened to their stories, and guided them through small lessons about discipline and kindness. But over time, some recognized him. They whispered quietly at the back of the room. One day, a boy asked him directly, "Are you that cop from the video?" The question hit him harder than he expected. For a moment, the old feeling of shame returned, but he took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes," he said. "That was me. And I wish it wasn't, but it happened, and I've been trying to learn from it." The boy didn't say anything for a while, then asked softly, "Are you different now?" The officer smiled faintly. "I'm trying to be," he replied. That moment stayed with him all week. He still worked under supervision at the police department. His duties were limited to desk work, paperwork, and assisting with outreach programs. He no longer wore his badge with pride, but with understanding. When he looked at it now, it didn't remind him of authority. It reminded him of responsibility. The station had a few new officers, younger and eager. Some respected him quietly for owning his mistakes. Others avoided him, afraid of being linked to his past. He didn't blame them. People had every right to see him through the lens of what he'd done. There was one thing that gave him peace: his growing friendship with the young attorney he had wronged. After months of silence, they had begun to exchange short emails about community work. The attorney had invited him to attend a local justice reform event as a listener, not a speaker. He hesitated for days before agreeing. He wasn't sure if people would want him there. But when he walked in, he was surprised. No one shouted or turned him away. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with cautious respect. The attorney greeted him calmly and introduced him to the group as someone who has seen both sides of the problem. Those words meant more than forgiveness. They meant trust. During that event, he listened to people share real stories of discrimination, fear, and lost faith in law enforcement. Each story felt like a mirror showing him the pain he had once ignored. For the first time, he didn't defend himself, didn't try to explain his side. He simply listened. Listening, he realized, was something he had rarely done before. It was strange how something so simple could change so much. After the session ended, he stayed behind while others left. The attorney walked up to him and said, "You stayed quiet the whole time." He nodded and replied, "Because I had nothing to add. I needed to hear it." The attorney smiled faintly and said, "That's a start." Weeks later, the officer got a call from his department head. They were considering allowing him to return to limited field work, mostly community policing and public engagement, not patrol duty. It wasn't a promotion, but it was an opportunity. He agreed immediately. The first day back on duty felt strange. His uniform fit the same, but his heart felt different. He didn't walk with the same stiffness. He smiled more. He greeted people first. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before. How nervous some people looked when a police car passed. How kids watched from a distance before daring to wave. One afternoon, he visited a school to talk about safety and respect. He told the children stories about his early days as a cop, about the mistakes he made, and the lessons he learned the hard way. He didn't hide his past. Instead, he used it to show them that people can change. The teachers watched silently, some surprised at how open he was. When the talk ended, one little girl raised her hand and asked, "Are you a good guy now?" He laughed softly and said, "I'm trying to be a better one than I was yesterday." The room filled with small smiles, and for the first time in years he felt something warm spread through his chest. Hope. At home, life was slowly returning to normal. His wife had forgiven him, not through words but through small gestures. She made his favorite breakfast again. She asked how his day went. Sometimes they sat together on the porch in silence, watching the evening sky. That silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. His son had started talking to him more too. One night, his son asked if he could come with him to the community center. He agreed instantly. They spent the day helping with a food drive. When they got home, his son said quietly, "I'm proud of what you're doing now." That sentence meant more than any medal or rank he had ever earned. As the months rolled on, the officer began to rebuild his connection with the community. He attended neighborhood meetings, joined cultural events, and met people he had once feared or misunderstood. Some still didn't trust him, and that was okay. He didn't expect forgiveness from everyone. He only hoped that his actions would slowly show his sincerity. One day he was asked to join a local panel that discussed police reform. He didn't speak as an expert, but as a man who had made mistakes. He shared his story openly, telling the audience how his pride had blinded him, how it had made him treat people unfairly. He didn't excuse himself or blame his environment. He simply said, "I was wrong and I'm still learning." When he finished, the room was silent. Then people began to clap, not for his past, but for his honesty. After the event, an older man approached him and said, "You remind me of someone I knew long ago, a man who thought he had all the answers until life proved him wrong." The officer smiled gently and replied, "Life has a way of doing that, doesn't it?" They both laughed quietly. He had once thought his life was over the day the truth came out. But looking back, he realized it had actually begun that day. It had stripped away everything fake and left him with the raw, painful truth. That truth had forced him to rebuild himself from the ground up. It had shown him that being strong wasn't about standing tall, it was about standing honest. The young attorney continued to check in with him every now and then. They weren't friends in the usual sense, but they shared a quiet understanding. Once during a community project, the attorney said, "You know, if more people saw what change looks like, maybe they'd believe it's possible." The officer replied, "Change isn't easy. It hurts, but maybe that's the only way it sticks." Their unlikely connection became a small symbol for others, a reminder that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it can shape the future. As time went on, the officer's story stopped appearing in the news. People moved on to new headlines, new controversies. He was no longer the center of attention, and he was grateful for that. He didn't want fame or sympathy. All he wanted was peace, and he found it in small moments, helping a family cross the street, comforting a scared teenager, or sharing a kind word with someone who expected none. He had learned that real strength wasn't in the uniform or the badge, but in empathy. It was in the courage to admit when you're wrong and the humility to make things right. One evening, he visited the same street where everything had started months before. He parked his car quietly and looked around. The place looked ordinary now. Cars passing by, people walking, kids riding bikes. But for him, it was where his old self had died and his new one had been born. He sat there for a long time, thinking about how far he had come. Before leaving, he whispered to himself, "Thank you for the lesson." It wasn't meant for anyone in particular, just for life itself. As he drove away, he realized something simple but powerful. The truth had destroyed his pride, but it had saved his soul. And though he could never undo the past, he could make the future better. One action, one person, one day at a time. He no longer chased respect. He earned it quietly, through patience and honesty. People who once looked at him with distrust now greeted him with cautious kindness. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was enough. He knew now that change doesn't happen in speeches or apologies. It happens in how you live every single day. Years later, when he finally retired, he didn't have the same shiny medals or loud praise as some of his peers. But he had something far greater, a clean heart, and the knowledge that he had spent his last years doing the right thing. On his final day in uniform, he looked at his badge one last time and placed it gently on the desk. It had once been a symbol of his pride, then of his shame, and finally of his growth. He walked out of the station without looking back. Outside, the air felt lighter. The world moved on around him. Buses, laughter, sirens, life. He took a deep breath and smiled. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that storm months ago. He was quieter, wiser, and free. The truth had cost him his pride, but it had given him something he didn't ever. People had every right to see him through the lens of what he'd done. There was one thing that gave him peace: his growing friendship with the young attorney he had wronged. After months of silence, they had begun to exchange short emails about community work. The attorney had invited him to attend a local justice reform event as a listener, not a speaker. He hesitated for days before agreeing. He wasn't sure if people would want him there. But when he walked in, he was surprised. No one shouted or turned him away. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with cautious respect. The attorney greeted him calmly and introduced him to the group as someone who has seen both sides of the problem. Those words meant more than forgiveness. They meant trust. During that event, he listened to people share real stories of discrimination, fear, and lost faith in law enforcement. Each story felt like a mirror showing him the pain he had once ignored. For the first time, he didn't defend himself, didn't try to explain his side. He simply listened. Listening, he realized, was something he had rarely done before. It was strange how something so simple could change so much. After the session ended, he stayed behind while others left. The attorney walked up to him and said, "You stayed quiet the whole time." He nodded and replied, "Because I had nothing to add. I needed to hear it." The attorney smiled faintly and said, "That's a start." Weeks later, the officer got a call from his department head. They were considering allowing him to return to limited field work, mostly community policing and public engagement, not patrol duty. It wasn't a promotion, but it was an opportunity. He agreed immediately. The first day back on duty felt strange. His uniform fit the same, but his heart felt different. He didn't walk with the same stiffness. He smiled more. He greeted people first. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before. How nervous some people looked when a police car passed. How kids watched from a distance before daring to wave. One afternoon, he visited a school to talk about safety and respect. He told the children stories about his early days as a cop, about the mistakes he made and the lessons he learned the hard way. He didn't hide his past. Instead, he used it to show them that people can change. The teachers watched silently, some surprised at how open he was. When the talk ended, one little girl raised her hand and asked, "Are you a good guy now?" He laughed softly and said, I'm trying to be a better one than I was yesterday." The room filled with small smiles, and for the first time in years he felt something warm spread through his chest. Hope. At home, life was slowly returning to normal. His wife had forgiven him, not through words but through small gestures. She made his favorite breakfast again. She asked how his day went. Sometimes they sat together on the porch in silence, watching the evening sky. That silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. His son had started talking to him more too. One night, his son asked if he could come with him to the community center. He agreed instantly. They spent the day helping with a food drive. When they got home, his son said quietly, "I'm proud of what you're doing now." That sentence meant more than any medal or rank he had ever earned. As the months rolled on, the officer began to rebuild his connection with the community. He attended neighborhood meetings, joined cultural events, and met people he had once feared or misunderstood. Some still didn't trust him, and that was okay. He didn't expect forgiveness from everyone. He only hoped that his actions would slowly show his sincerity. One day, he was asked to join a local panel that discussed police reform. He didn't speak as an expert, but as a man who had made mistakes. He shared his story openly, telling the audience how his pride had blinded him, how it had made him treat people unfairly. He didn't excuse himself or blame his environment. He simply said, "I was wrong, and I'm still learning." When he finished, the room was silent. Then people began to clap, not for his past, but for his honesty. After the event, an older man approached him and said, "You remind me of someone I knew long ago, a man who thought he had all the answers until life proved him wrong." The officer smiled gently and replied, "Life has a way of doing that, doesn't it?" They both laughed quietly. He had once thought his life was over the day the truth came out, but looking back, he realized it had actually begun that day. It had stripped away everything fake and left him with the raw, painful truth. That truth had forced him to rebuild himself from the ground up. It had shown him that being strong wasn't about standing tall. It was about standing honest. The young attorney continued to check in with him every now and then. They weren't friends in the usual sense, but they shared a quiet understanding. Once, during a community project, the attorney said, "You know, if more people saw what change looks like, maybe they'd believe it's possible." The officer replied, "Change isn't easy. It hurts. But maybe that's the only way it sticks." Their unlikely connection became a small symbol for others, a reminder that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it can shape the future. As time went on, the officer's story stopped appearing in the news. People moved on to new headlines, new controversies. He was no longer the center of attention, and he was grateful for that. He didn't want fame or sympathy. All he wanted was peace, and he found it in small moments, helping a family cross the street, comforting a scared teenager, or sharing a kind word with someone who expected none. He had learned that real strength wasn't in the uniform or the badge, but in empathy. It was in the courage to admit when you're wrong and the humility to make things right. One evening, he visited the same street where everything had started months before. He parked his car quietly and looked around. The place looked ordinary now. Cars passing by, people walking, kids riding bikes. But for him, it was where his old self had died and his new one had been born. He sat there for a long time, thinking about how far he had come. Before leaving, he whispered to himself, "Thank you for the lesson." It wasn't meant for anyone in particular, just for life itself. As he drove away, he realized something simple but powerful. The truth had destroyed his pride, but it had saved his soul. And though he could never undo the past, he could make the future better. One action, one person, one day at a time. He no longer chased respect. He earned it quietly through patience and honesty. People who once looked at him with distrust now greeted him with cautious kindness. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was enough. He knew now that change doesn't happen in speeches or apologies. It happens in how you live every single day. Years later, when he finally retired, he didn't have the same shiny medals or loud praise as some of his peers, but he had something far greater, a clean heart, and the knowledge that he had spent his last years doing the right thing. On his final day in uniform, he looked at his badge one last time and placed it gently on the desk. It had once been a symbol of his pride, then of his shame, and finally of his growth. He walked out of the station without looking back. Outside, the air felt lighter. The world moved on around him, Buses, laughter, sirens, life. He took a deep breath and smiled. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that storm months ago. He was quieter, wiser, and free. The truth had cost him his pride, but it had given him something he didn't have